Pat, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Great to be on one.
Yeah, very excited to have you on. We were just chatting, before this, about how we've been fans and been following your newsletter for a while. So it's really great to have you on. One of the things that I wanted to, and we're going to dig into the newsletter and so much more. But one of the things that I wanted to really start by asking you was, and this is mostly because of your leadership career, right? You've been at Oracle, ThoughtWorks, N26, and obviously you have this newsletter. But before we dive in to all of that, I wanted to ask you, in your career, from all the different companies that you've been at, who's been the most memorable boss for you and why?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have to give a little bit of I guess, some context because it's a little bit funny as I was consulting because I didn't actually have a direct manager for a very long time. So, I've got a large gap there. But I'm going to talk about, I think, sort of two people. So my very first manager when I left university, I was actually working at Flight Centre in Australia, and my manager was a non-technical person, and she was a really great manager. And the reason, like, I remember this very well is, she was very caring. She was clear that she couldn't help me solve technical problems, right? And so, in my early career, I was looking for someone to grow from, but actually I did appreciate the support that she could provide me. And so I remember, we would meet once a week for breakfast. We'd have a chat about, what things I'm struggling with, what things like I wanted to do. And then she was always trying to work out how to sort of support me in trying to help find those sort of goals. And I think for me, that was a really great exemplar of, I think, a really good manager, of someone who recognizes, where they couldn't actually help me, but also providing that support and sort of nurturing around what they could help me with, particularly from an organizational perspective. So that was one manager that I think gave me a really good example of how you could be a successful manager or leader without necessarily having the same background as the person you're actually working with. The second person that I wanted to talk about was actually my first manager at Oracle. And he was very technical, so he was almost the opposite. But I would say that he was probably earlier on the sort of management side. So I think we were working on a sort of healthcare platform back in the day. It was very, very complex, and we were distributed across India, America, and Australia, which was where I was based. He was on conference calls all the time, and he was very technical. And I think he was almost a little bit resentful that he never really got a chance to actually write code and things like this. Being a sort of earlier sort of stage developer, we were using sort of waterfall type stuff back then. I was like really itching to write code, but we were in like 3 monthly kind of telephone calls with people across different, countries trying to talk about what we were actually going to build. I kept pestering my manager. I was like, when do I get to write code? When do I get to write code? When do I actually get to do something rather than just simply talking about the thing that we're going to do? And it kind of got to a point where, he realized that he wasn't actually going to get a chance to do the things that he enjoyed doing unless he went sort of overtime and sort of scripted and wrote stuff on his own time. And so he started to give me sort of his side projects of things that he always wanted to do to try to maybe improve the environment. So we were using sort of continuous integration, which is like a tool for building software. And, he wanted to script the tool that we were using so that it would actually work well with Oracle internal systems. He never got the chance. And so he gave me the opportunity to kind of take his idea and sort of bring it to life. And so that was like a little mini side project. And I think over time, he grew comfortable that I could actually help him, achieve his little side projects, and gave me this sort of autonomy and freedom. And, I could then go to him when I sort of didn't quite understand how to approach something, or I encountered a challenge, and he would help me walk through that. Like, he'd make the time. And so they're two characteristics that I think that had a very strong sort of impression on me, which is, making sure that you give people an interesting challenge that you may personally want to do, but actually it helps the other person grow. I talk about that as multiplying the other person. And then the other side is, once again, that sort of support structure of, he was very technical, but he didn't know exactly the problems that I was facing at the time, but he could at least help me walk through them, walk through my sort of thinking process, and provide some, alternatives or different opportunities. So I think those two people were really strong role models for me as managers early in my career.
Yeah, what an incredible way to start your career. Like getting, I think those are two ends of the spectrum. And what's interesting is, especially with the first manager that you were talking about, um, it sounds like they were just very self-aware. And they knew that and they were upfront about it. And
Yeah,
but they also even had a solution for like how to cover for the things that they knew that they lacked. Um, yeah, and it's very interesting for you to like look back on that and understand. I mean, in this case, it's them being technical or not, but I feel like we all have things that we know we're not good at, and it's okay to be authentic about that.
absolutely. And I think that's the thing is that, when I was at Oracle, I did see a couple of other technical managers where, they tried to always pretend that they knew everything, and you can see where they aren't, right? And it comes through as this inauthenticity. And, people are smart. They'll see through these kind of, I wouldn't say lies, but like, truths that are sort of covered up. And so it's better just to be authentic, I think, and be clear about how you can help people and how you can't help people.
I want to dig in on this phrase that you used. It just sounded so interesting to me. So you said um, you refer to it as like multiplying the other person. Could you tell me more about that? What does that mean to multiply another person?
Yeah, I often talk about sort of two modes, particularly for early stage leaders, of that maker versus multiplier mode. And I think a book that I read early on in my leadership journey was the Multipliers book by Liz, I forget her last name. But for me, that was a really great example of, taking a mindset as a leader of multiplying not just yourself, but the people that you're responsible for and the team or organization or department that you're responsible for. And I see this challenge particularly, with software engineers or individual contributors because they're so deep into that personal creation. And I think when people transition into that leadership mode, one of the things is that mindset of not moving to thinking like a multiplier, but thinking like, oh, I have to do more. I have to have the best answer. I have to take the most complex problems, which is very much the sort of maker mode. And I think in order to successfully transition to that leadership sort of mentality, I think the question then starts to, turn to what can I do to help multiply everyone else? And sometimes that means giving up a little bit about the things that you personally enjoyed creating or making. And so that's a really internal, interesting struggle. And I mean, I still recognize it as well. Everyone gets their, fun from doing particular things that they enjoy doing. But sometimes the right thing to do is to give that to somebody else in your team because they're going to grow as an opportunity and multiply. And so I think that's the interesting sort of insight I've been sort of learning, teaching, and sort of have arrived at as what is a good way to lead is to think about how you multiply all the people you're responsible for.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I love that phrase. It's just it's so instructive. I have to ask you. So as it relates to you know basically delegating and you mentioned like it might be fun for you, but sometimes it's important to delegate. What happens is as you scale as a leader, does it mean that you never get to do the fun things that maybe you enjoyed once before? Is that a sacrifice that people need to make, or can they still do some of those things?
Honestly, it is a little bit of a sacrifice. I mean, I think one of the things is it's more of a question of how much of your time do you get to spend doing the thing that you really enjoy. So, I started off as a developer, and so most of my time was writing code, right? So, I mean, even developers don't write code 100% of the time. They should be, talking to users and showing their work. Um, but you're going to spend less of that when you're working in a leadership role because your value add is, working on the environment and helping people in their sort of growth path. So I think naturally you're going to be spending less time doing the thing that perhaps you originally started doing, but then it's also the awareness that you're also adding value in a very different way and recognizing that is more impactful, that maybe nobody's taking care of. It's like, it's great that you have lots of people that are creating and making, but somebody also needs to think about how well is everyone working together, taking care of things that are maybe outside of the reach of a team. Often, I talk about managers taking care of organizational bureaucracy, and that itself is a great way to multiply by removing obstacles and removing dependencies or enabling dependencies so that people can focus on, doing the most when they get to that point and they need those dependencies. And part of that is unfortunately you're going to have to give up a little bit of your time around doing some of the things you enjoy doing. I know some technical leaders still manage to make some time for that. And I think it's a question about how much sort of free time can you whip up in your schedule, but also how well is it related to the work that you're actually doing. So for instance, technical directors I've worked with, for instance, might be very heavily involved in a technical strategy, and they sort of need to have a hands-on awareness of what's the current performance or quality of their infrastructure. And so they need to get quite hands-on, and that can be a research topic of being quite hands-on and sort of making. But it's probably not always the best case where you're on the critical path for some work, because leaders and managers are always going to be the people who are interrupted, and you're going to have to deal with emergencies. And so, if you do take on something that you do like doing, try not to be on that critical path would be my tip.
Yeah, that's a good tip. You're right. Like, you don't want to be the bottleneck or on the critical path, like you said. Let's talk about when you first started managing and leading teams. Obviously today, I mean, people look to you for leadership lessons and management advice. But when you started out, what were some of the mistakes that you tended to make?
Yeah, a lot. I can think about one of the times that I was leading a team very early on. It was my first time as a sort of technical leader. I was responsible for a team. It was a pretty large team. I think we had about 8 devs, a couple of QAs, a business analyst back then, a project manager. And I was responsible for everyone. And so I felt like there was a lot of weight on my shoulders of, if I didn't do the right thing, I was going to disappoint a lot of people. And so I think there's one of the mistakes I made is that I'd kind of work on problems by myself, because like I didn't want to disappoint everyone on my team. I wanted to make sure I was doing everything as best as I could and leading as best as I could. But of course, it was my first time, or one of the earlier times, and so I didn't know how to do certain things. And I figured, well, I don't want to necessarily ask people on my team, because that would maybe show that I'm not really doing the role that I should be doing. And it kind of led into this situation where I put so much pressure on myself. I wasn't really asking for help. And I kind of started to feel a lot of stress. Now, that stress would come out in a couple of different ways. Is that, I think when I get interrupted, I get a little bit snappy sometimes. And particularly under stress, that sort of gets amplified. I think everyone reacts differently to stress. But I think for me, for instance, I know that I start to raise my voice a little bit more. And that was indeed some feedback I got from that sort of, project manager and a couple of people at the team. They're like, "Hey, Pat, is everything okay? It's like you're not really feeling very well, or you're responding very strongly to things that aren't really a big deal." And a lot of that was like talking through that stress. And I think for me, the lesson there was like, learning when you're starting to struggle, but also having to find a support network. Sometimes it might be people in your team, sometimes it might be people outside of the team, but don't try to tackle things by yourself. And so I think that's definitely one of those kind of cases. Another example that comes to mind was kind of a similar situation, is that we were growing a team relatively large, and this was actually to a point where we ended up with a team that we wanted to split to 2 teams. But at the time, I was sort of leading both teams, so a group of about sort of 15 people, and I was trying to ask for help and support, but once again, I felt like there was a lot of things I had to take care of. And so I started putting in extra hours to sort of, deal with all the things that the team needed to take care of. And then I would get to my to-do list of things. And so I was kind of working really long days. And at some point, like, I think my body just gave out. And so like I wasn't sleeping very well. And I literally, I think, fell like real sick with a cold, and I was out for like 3 days, right? I just needed to sleep. I just needed to get some rest. And it was actually during that sort of off time that I sort of reflected on, okay, why did I get into this role? Or why did I find myself in this position? And what can I do to make it more sustainable? At that point, I realized I was once again maybe taking on too much, and I needed to start delegating a lot more rigorously, because I was already delegating, but not to match the pace of the size that the team was growing. And so as more people kind of kept getting added in, I kind of didn't want to add more burden to the other existing people on the team. And I just kind of kept taking more and more. And so I ended up coming up with this practice of feature leads, which was, I didn't want to give away all responsibility, particularly because some people, were very also early on in their career journey. But if I could give them a certain area to take care of, that gave me less, worries about taking care of everything. It was less complex for somebody to focus on leading. And depending on that person, I could support them differently. So for more experienced engineers, they could go off, lead their area. They knew how to scope out work, design work with business stakeholders. For people who were much, much earlier, I would probably sit down with them and walk through them step by step and try to understand how they would approach it and to try to work out gaps. And so for me, that was a real great learning of realizing I was on a path to burnout. Like I literally physically reacted to that. And I also needed to change that environment. Otherwise, I would just end up in the same position probably a couple of months later.
Yeah, no, I think those are so many good lessons there. And I really liked, I mean, subtly what I heard, especially as your team started to get large, was you obviously started to trust the team more for different aspects so that it wasn't all on your shoulders. But I really like that you use a nuanced approach and understood that, people have different seniority levels and different strengths, and each, and the way that each person was managed was also different. So I thought that was really cool too.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it was the only sustainable way.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. So Pat, you have one of the questions that I think like a lot of people always ask us is, how do you know if someone's a successful leader? And like, part of that is, how do you know if someone is? How do you know if you are a successful leader? Like, how do you evaluate yourself? So what are your thoughts on that? Like, if someone were to ask you what makes a successful leader, what would you say?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I tend to think about with this. I have what I call as the holiday test, right? So can you go away for a holiday for a week or two, and does everything keep running without you? So for me, that's a really great test because, I'm based here in Europe, and it's very common that people take 2 to 3 weeks out. I think if you're in the North American continent, people still check emails on holidays. They're not really on holiday. And so for me, the holiday test is, can you sort of disengage from everything? And that means that you've built what I consider a self-empowered team. So, if there's an emergency, then people don't wait for you, or they don't have to escalate it to you, is that people feel empowered to say, okay, this is a surprise, but we can try to deal with this until, Pat gets back or something like that, right? So they can kind of take care of surprises and actually things keep moving on. It also means that you've probably delegated and devolved enough responsibility such that you're no longer the sort of bottleneck in decision making or in planning processes. So I think that's definitely one sort of test that I tend to think about, the holiday test of, can you take some time out? The other one is really thinking about, how well are people sort of growing? And so this is really coming back to that multiplying sort of mindset, is that, you have some people that are very strong leaders, but they're very directive with the people that they're working with. And sometimes that means that people don't actually get an opportunity to grow and apply their skills, and also, have an opportunity to grow. And particularly in a market like we are with technology today, where everyone has so many job opportunities all the time, if somebody gets an opportunity that's aligned with their own personal growth opportunity, often it's more compelling for them to move to that company or a different team where they can go live that out. And so I think that's the other aspect, which is, if you're leading well, I should be seeing that, people in your team are actually growing as well. So sometimes that means growing new skills. Sometimes it's actually about leaving your team to go lead another team because they've grown as a leader and therefore capable of also leading as well. So they're kind of two characteristics I would tend to be thinking about. And then, of course, that your team is actually delivering value, right? So we all work for businesses mostly, or if you're a government or a nonprofit, there's a purpose to a team. And I think it's very important that, teams don't just go around playing with things, that everyone's happy that they're growing, but not actually delivering value. And so I think that's the other test, which is to make sure that people actually feel like they're moving the company mission forward or their product mission forward, and they can sort of connect their daily day-to-day work with progress on whatever that mission may be.
Yeah, and it's really interesting just on the point around the impact of the team. Especially within larger organizations, teams do have reputations. So that's the team that, oh, let's have that team work on that. We know it's going to get it's going to be done and we won't have to worry about it. So yeah, it's super interesting. All those things that you said make a lot of sense. I think the holiday test is brilliant. And yeah, and I think like another sign of, I've heard it also put in terms of your job is to constantly look to put yourself out of a job,
Mhm.
and really work on the system. And so actually that's another thing that you tend to talk about as well, right? Which is it's you want to manage the system and not the people. Could
Yes.
you talk to us a little bit about what the difference is?
Yeah, so this is actually a quote that I borrowed from Grace Hopper. So she talks about you manage things and you lead people. And when I think about things, they're things that don't really have a personality like people or a temperament. And often those things, people feel like they can't really influence them, right? So I think when people step into a management leadership role for the first time, I think my role is to manage the people in the team. But often the sort of productivity of a team isn't really dictated by what an individual does. It's really determined by the process or the team structure of how they work with each other. So I'll give you an example. I remember consulting for a bank, and we had two teams, one development team and one testing team. The testers were sort of measured by how many bugs they could find. The developers were tested by how quickly they could actually resolve features. And now, when I joined this team, there was a lot of, I joined the development team, there was a lot of sort of contention and sort of conflict across both of those things, because developers would sort of claim a sort of story or feature was completed. And then testers would almost like celebrate when they found bugs, because that's what they were being measured for, right? And so you almost ended up with this like very heated sort of culture and very defensive culture of developers saying, no, that's not a bug. That's, that's a new feature request or it's a modification. And there was so much energy into like that sort of debating about whether or not something was a feature or not, that people lost sight of the bigger picture of, are we actually delivering value, right? Like what is it that the user needs? What's the trade-off for that? And can we get to those people faster? And that is the system that some managers had set up. We call it a less than optimal system. And in order to change that, you couldn't really talk to a tester or a developer to say, hey, like we need to change the way that you measured. That's set up by other people in the business. And I think that's the thing that I see managers responsible for, which is looking at the incentives and processes and structure that are often the things that get in people's way. And if managers listen to people in their team, like they'll hear what frustrates them, but they need to step back to ask themselves what in the environment is contributing to that. And so in this example, like by changing the sort of metrics and the measurements away from individual goals or individual sort of functional goals to a shared team goal of shipping a valuable, good quality feature quick, it changes it away from an individual target to actually a shared target, which then incentivizes more teamwork rather than sort of, I'm done with my part, now go off and do your part as well. And so that's what I think of when I think about managing things and managing the system.
That's the best example. I love that example. And it's so true. And I feel like, especially between cross-departmental
Mm.
initiatives, you could see things just like what you said, also between, say, marketing and sales. Like there's not enough leads, or the leads are not good quality, or our close rate is down. And it's just it's very interesting, right? Like you see these sorts of things, and I love your approach of saying, well, actually these are not bad people. It's just like the system is rigged in a way that they're gonna have there's gonna be contention. And yeah, I think it also takes a certain level of like skill to be able to like take a step back and take a holistic view like that.
Absolutely. I mean, as you said, you see this in many other departments, and a very common one everyone's probably suffered as a result is typical customer services, right? So there are many sort of systems set up where customer services are set up to resolve as many calls as they can within a certain amount of time. And a great way that people can game that system is simply just, canceling a call with somebody, right? As a user, you get really frustrated because you have to then call back. But from their side, they've dealt with a ticket and then, no.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I love that. That's such a good example. In terms of, so we've talked about now a little bit about goals. And, one of the things that you talk a lot about is just the importance of constraints. Um, and, when you do have goals and, like as a manager or leader, you go to a team and you give them this goal or a task. Um, what are the things that people usually get wrong when doing that? Or what are some common mistakes?
Yeah, so I think one common mistake when I think about this is sort of no constraints. And a classic example is go off and do something without actually a time constraint, right? And so I think it's Parkinson's law, which is like, a work item will fill whatever available time that you have. And I see this with engineers all the time in particular, who will go off and then they'll find something else to work on that's kind of related to that. And they'll just kind of keep digging. And then, all the time's gone by and they've gone, okay, this is the thing that I was supposed to actually work on first. And so one constraint I would often think about is sort of imposing a time constraint. That's why I like things like sort of extreme programming and Scrum, is that there's a built-in review point, like once a week or once every fortnight or 2 weeks, to sort of ask, did we set out to do the things that we did and how did we do based on what we'd planned for that time period? To me, it's less important if people are hitting them. It's more of a question of, okay, if they didn't do that, why or why not? What is it about the system? Is it about clarity? Is it about information? What can we do to help unblock that? But you get some feedback and information. And so I think if you don't have any constraints, particularly with time, then you often end up with very divergent expectations, and that leads to a lot of conflict a lot later. Without the time constraint as well, I think it also means that people don't get an opportunity to learn. So they get that delayed feedback, which means that they can't really adjust their sort of behavior. Another common example of forgetting about constraints, and I think a lot of this comes down to, the want to give more autonomy to people, is, use your best judgment. The problem with, something so broad like this is everyone has a different sort of perception about what best means in their context. And so I can tend to think about this fractally. So, you have your best judgment based on you as a person, but, you and the people that you're working with in your team may have very different perceptions. I'll see this quite frequently if people are doing code reviews, is that people might give feedback quite differently because they have a different perception of best. And then there's a lot of conflict over should they address that comment in a code review or not, because, people have different standards. And I think one thing that managers can do here, which I have often done, is to sort of help, agree on a team approach. So make the sort of constraint agreed and visible, so that you all have at least a shared vocabulary around maybe what good quality looks like for this particular team. So I think there are a couple of mistakes that a lot of managers make.
Yeah, it's really interesting as it relates to developers. At least I know there's also this term called yak shaving, which is very similar. It's you do all these other things and you don't get to the main thing because because of the lack of constraints. I like that a lot. Um, you know, I think the other thing that's super interesting about this is just yeah, and it's related to constraints a little bit. And if you have time constraints, obviously like the next thing is, well, you just have to prioritize. I feel like especially when you're managing or leading a team, like there are so many different ways that you could spend your time. Like and there isn't necessarily this super defined playbook. Maybe there's things like, well, we need to do one-on-ones, and okay, so that's a few hours a week, but it's not like there's this like super defined playbook. So how do you decide what to prioritize and what to work on?
Yeah, really great question. And it's a very common sort of example. I think it's kind of interesting because I've been running some training with some early stage leaders. And one interesting feedback I got recently was like, Pat, you need to tell us where we should prioritize our time, right? Like that's a struggle that everyone always sort of talks with. The challenge is that it depends, but I'll talk about why it depends. I think ultimately for me, the guiding answer or how to answer this question is really contextual. And so you need to understand a lot about, what is maybe constraints in the system or things that the team is struggling with. The things that if you do something may actually have not so much impact in one situation versus more impact in another. And so in order to sort of answer this question, I ask a slightly different question, which is, if I was to do one action, what one action would have the most impact, right? So it's very easy to sort of take lots of action, but you don't sort of think about like, okay, how much effect is that going to have? This is one of the reasons I sort of think about that sort of system, is that, good example is, one way of dealing with an emergency is, okay, I'm going to get my hands involved and I'm going to take care of that emergency, right? Emergency solved, done. But what may happen is, if you haven't actually sort of treated where that comes from, you may find yourself solving that emergency again and again. And so the thing that I would be always thinking about is, am I sort of multiplying and improving sort of the system? And what action would I take to actually improve that? And so that's a real situational, contextual sort of question, because it'll depend on the people that you're working with. It'll depend on what problems your team are currently facing. If you're dealing with a very junior team, the most impactful thing that you might be able to do, which I've done a lot, is, to take the team aside and actually to train them, like to walk them through best practices of how to do work together, about either designing code, writing code, or using good design patterns. For a more experienced team, that same action has much, much less impact, right? So, taking them aside, teaching them basic principles, they'll be like, Pat, what are you doing? I already know this. And so in that case, for a more senior team, the most impactful action that you might have is helping them maybe with, once again, the typically organizational bureaucracy. It might be about, influencing another team and getting buy-in about some sort of work that needs to get done at the same time, or about trying to get, an investment in dealing with technical quality, or, some sort of investment. But I think that's the question that everyone has to answer for themselves in their situation, which is, if we have limited amount of time, the question is, what can you do to have the most impact in that time? And so, a good way to do that is to sort of brainstorm all the possible problems that you have, and then to think about which of those problems is the most constraining. And so this is kind of taking a little bit of that theory of constraints. And if you relieve that constraint a little bit, you can actually have the most impact from that side. So you can think about it from that side. If you feel that you're in a really great place, so you feel like you've built like a really high performing team, then what I would do is sort of brainstorm a list of sort of experiments. So things that we might try doing that has the potential for, high impact. The thing is, if you're already in a pretty good place, you don't really know what the impact's going to be, unlike dealing with a very large constraint, where you can sort of say, okay, that's slowing us down, or that's distracting us a lot. But if you're in a good place, then you can think about experimenting. And I think that's a nice way to sort of prioritize those two worlds.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's very interesting that you just call out, again, just going back to the system approach, that because I'm spending my time, hopefully like there aren't these recurring problems, or like the system gets better. So like I don't have to spend the same amount of time doing, the same thing next week or next month. And yeah, it's just a really, really good way to approach things. Um, Another topic I wanted to chat with you about is, and it kind of relates to systems again here, is you have this quote that where you say, "Tell me how you measure me, and I'll tell you how I behave." And we had an example of this where you were talking about, the developers and the QA folks. Are there other examples where, policies can really shape the culture of the team?
Yeah, absolutely. So another common one that I've seen a lot, which you see less of these days, is typically when you have a very different department and organization dealing with operations and infrastructure, and you have a team that's producing software. And so, I see this more classically in larger organizations that have been around for a long time, just because that's how their organizational structure evolved. So I remember one client where, you had a head of operations and infrastructure, and then you had a head of development, and they had large teams responsible, development teams on one side, and then people who are responsible for networks, servers, all these other sort of things there. Now, the people in operations and infrastructure, if you sort of think of them separately, one common goal or target that they typically have is stability and resilience, right? So no downtime, lack of breakages, that's kind of one sort of goal. And then development, often you get a lot of pressure from the rest of the business around new product development, new features, and this creates like this interesting tension, because a really great way of ensuring good uptime and resilience is by not making any changes, right? Like you've kind of set up a system and a conflict where, from an operations infrastructure side, a great way of maintaining resilience is to make sure that anything that development teams produce are bulletproof, right? They go through every single checklist, they've proven every single test case, and you kind of have this sort of opposing sort of set of motives where development teams want to release quickly, but now they feel these constraints from operations infrastructure saying they have to go through all these rigorous checklists, they have to get reviews, they have to go through all these sign-off processes, and it feels like a slow process. This is one of the reasons why I think DevOps as a culture, as a way of working, has been so popular and so essential, is that, that is a organizational conflict set up by these sort of opposing sort of measurement structures. And in order to sort of address that, then there's better ways of doing that. And the book, if you want to learn more about this, is from the Accelerate. So this is by Dr. Nicole Fosgren, plus a number of other authors. And it kind of shows some of the other metrics, which are a lot more holistic. So not necessarily thinking about departmental goals, about parts in a value chain, but actually optimizing for the entire value chain as well.
Yeah, no, I think I think that's awesome. And what was the title of the book again?
Accelerate.
Oh, Accelerate. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I have not read that, so that gets added to the list. Speaking of books, you in your book, you mention something called the Fixler rule. What is that?
Good question. I have to actually remember what that was.
It's named after, I guess you named it after one of your directors, Eric Fixler. This rule dictates that you may politely exit when a meeting has ceased to yield value for you.
Oh yeah, no, I think this came from a different organization. So this is a really interesting, a lot of people spend a lot of time in meetings, but I think a lot of meetings are poorly conducted. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why your tool exists, to help people produce better meetings. And so that rule, yeah, is, if a meeting isn't providing any value, having more people in a meeting tends to slow it down. And so there's the theory of then leaving the meeting if you feel that it's no longer offering any value from you.
Yeah, and is that like, I mean, do you ever is that something that like culturally you encourage in your teams, for people to just come in and go out when it makes sense?
I do encourage it, but I think it's very hard for people to do that, because I think human norms, or maybe other company norms, tend to override that, which is like people join a meeting and then leave the meeting when it's sort of officially announced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's interesting. And then, of course, there's this concept of like dynamic agendas too, where if you know that you're going to be going for a period of time, and really like you really need a certain person's input for a portion of it, like maybe they can come in for that part, and then, obviously, like, and then after that 20-minute period or something, then they can exit. So yeah, like you said, there's probably ways that one could encourage that even more.
Absolutely.
So Pat, this has been incredibly valuable. So many great insights, so many great examples, and so much learning about systems in general. One question that we ask all of the guests that we have on the show is, for all the managers and leaders out there looking to constantly get better at their craft of managing and leading teams, what words of wisdom, just tips or trick resources, or just parting advice would you leave them with?
Yeah, I think if I was to leave one final tip, is that I think as an industry, we've got a lot better at providing information and resources to support people. I think everyone is at a different point in their leadership journey. So some people might have picked up, better communication skills, other people better mediation or conflict management skills. But we have so much opportunity to always improve. And so, like with a lot of things in life, it's a sort of journey, not an end. And I think it's very helpful to join a community, to look out explicitly for resources to continually hone and improve your particular skills. So, listen to these podcasts that give you more tips about being a great manager, join communities, read a lot more books. And I think you'll be a much better and stronger leader and manager as a result.
And that's great advice. And a great place to end it. Pat, so thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks very much for having me. Nice chatting to you.